We talk a lot about, the economy, tech innovations, all really important stuff.
Absolutely. Big topics.
But what about the health of our democracy itself? How do you even gauge that?
That's a huge question. And it's crucial for everyone, really, no matter where you stand politically.
Right. So today, that's our mission here on the Deep Dive. We want to understand some potential warning signs, indicators that maybe things aren't as solid as they seem.
And we've got some interesting material to look at analyses of recent government actions, some expert views on how democracies can, well, weaken.
So just think for a second, maybe you listening right now, what would make you suspect a democracy might be getting weaker? What would be a sign?
It's a good thought exercise.
Yeah.
And to help frame this, let's imagine like a scale.
Scale for democracy health.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Picture it from, say, 0 to 7. At one end, maybe level 0, you've got your truly free, open society, all rights protected, rule of law for everyone.
The ideal, basically.
The ideal. And at the other extreme, level 7, total government control, no dissent allowed, a totalitarian state.
Okay, so the full spectrum.
Right. We won't be dwelling on those extremes today, but having that range helps us see the more subtle shifts that can happen in between.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's use that scale idea and look at some real examples from the sources we have. We've got an analysis on several executive orders. Let's start with this one. Executive Order 1151. It's titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing.
Right. So essentially stopping diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. That's the stated aim.
But the analysis we looked at suggests this kind of action, well, it could actually centralize power more.
And potentially limit efforts towards inclusivity, yeah. It's an example of how something administrative sounding
Can have bigger ripples, potentially affecting democratic values. Okay. What else?
Well, sticking with that theme, there's Executive Order 14173, Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity.
Sounds positive on the surface.
It does, but what it actually does is revoke previous orders that mandated non-discrimination in federal contracting.
So the potential effect, according to the source,
is that it could weaken the enforcement mechanisms for civil rights, fewer safeguards for certain groups.
which again touches on fundamental democratic principles of equality and protection.
Precisely. Then we shift gears slightly to education. Order 14190, Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling.
Okay, the title itself is strong.
Very. It aims to prohibit teaching materials deemed anti-American or promoting gender ideology, and even talks about investigating educators.
Wow, that immediately brings up questions about academic freedom, doesn't it? And, the importance of different perspectives in learning.
Absolutely. It feels very top-down, and the concern raised is that it could stifle open discussion, limit what students are exposed to.
And if we think back to that democracy scale.
Exactly. When you start seeing the suppression of diverse viewpoints or the threat of punishment for educators, it aligns with characteristics that move away from that fully open end of the scale.
Towards
A level 1 source identifies as illiberal democracy, level 3 on their scale. It's where you still have elections, maybe, but core democratic norms are eroding. Dissent gets suppressed.
Okay. Illiberal democracy. And you mentioned AI earlier.
Right. Another order, 14179, removing barriers to American leadership in artificial intelligence. The goal is promoting AI development without ideological bias.
Which sounds reasonable, but
But the worry expressed in the analysis is that this framing could be used to push aside really crucial ethical considerations in how AI is developed and deployed, issues of fairness, bias, impact on society.
so suppressing ethical debate in the name of unbiased progress.
That's the concern highlighted.
Yeah.
There are a couple other orders mentioned, 14178 and 14176, but these ones we've discussed seem more directly linked to these potential indicators of democratic decline.
It's interesting how these pieces, DEI, civil rights, contracting, education, AI ethics, start to form a pattern when looked at together.
And that's exactly what the source analyzing these suggests. They argue that these orders collectively point towards that level 3 illiberal democracy.
And what are the specific indicators they pull out for that level?
They highlight the suppression of dissent and academic freedom, which clearly links back to the education and DEI orders.
Makes sense.
And also the centralization of authority, which you can see potentially happening with the changes to civil rights enforcement and maybe the approach to AI development.
So consolidating power, limiting certain voices.
while still maintaining the outward appearance of democracy. It's a subtle shift. Interestingly, the source does acknowledge one order about declassifying JFK, RFK, MLK assassination files as a positive step for transparency.
Okay, so it's not all one-directional, but the overall trend identified is concerning.
That's the assessment presented, yes. That transparency measure happens alongside these other trends that seem to weaken checks and balances.
Right. It shows the complexity, but the main thrust of the analysis points downwards on that scale.
Now, let's look at another order, because it pushes the analysis potentially further down the scale. This is Executive Order 14288, Strengthening and Unleashing America's Law Enforcement.
Okay. What does that entail?
It directs the Attorney General to create a system for providing legal resources, including potentially pro bono help from private firms for law enforcement officers who face legal expenses or liabilities from doing their jobs.
Legal help for officers.
Okay.
And there's a link to private law firms.
Apparently so. The source mentions agreements reportedly made between the administration and several major law firms, which included provisions for offering these kinds of free legal services to law enforcement.
So what's the concern there? Why is that flagged?
The criticism is that this could effectively obligate these private firms to defend officers, perhaps even in civil rights cases, which could really compromise the independence of the legal profession.
Blurring the lines between independent counsel and the state.
Exactly. It raises ethical questions, and the source analyzing this suggests this development aligns more with Level 4 on their scale, a hybrid regime.
Level 4, hybrid regime. What does that look like?
Generally, it's characterized by a really powerful executive branch, a media that's under pressure or partially controlled,
Okay.
and an expansion of police powers, sometimes operating in legally gray areas.
And how does this order fit that description?
Well, providing this kind of legal backing and indemnification, especially potentially through mandated pro bono work, is seen as an expansion of state power supporting law enforcement.
Right.
And the intertwining of government directives with private law firms is seen as blurring that crucial line between independent legal advocacy and state interests. That blurring is considered a hallmark of these hybrid regimes.
Where democratic institutions might still exist on paper?
But they're manipulated or compromised to serve the interests of those in power. The facade is there, but the substance is eroding.
This does feel like a significant step, moving from policy changes to potentially altering the functioning of independent institutions like the legal system.
It's a serious point raised in the analysis, and it connects to another key perspective we have from a source titled, "How Will We Know When We Have Lost Our Democracy?"
Okay, what's their take?
They introduce this concept of competitive authoritarianism. It's a bit different from old-school dictatorships.
How so?
Well, they argue that today, elected leaders who want more power often don't need military coups. Instead, they use the existing institutions, law enforcement, tax agencies, regulators against their political opponent.
Weaponizing the system itself.
Precisely. To punish critics, reward allies, and basically tilt the playing field heavily in their own favor. Elections might still happen, but they aren't truly fair.
Are there examples given?
Yes, the authors point to places like Hungary, India, Serbia, Turkey, Venezuela as countries where this pattern has emerged or is emerging.
And you mentioned earlier this can be subtle, right? Hard to spot.
Extremely hard, because it often uses legal-seeming tools, lawsuits, audits, investigations, regulatory hurdles. It's not always overt repression.
So people might not realize what's happening until it's quite advanced.
Right.
Like the Venezuela example you mentioned.
Exactly. So the authors ask, how do we know? How can we tell if we're on that path?
What's their proposed metric?
It's simple but powerful. What is the cost of opposing the government?
The cost of opposition.
Yeah.
Explain that.
In a healthy democracy, you should be able to disagree, protest peacefully, support the opposition, criticize leaders, without fear of retribution from the state. That's fundamental.
Free speech, right of assembly.
All of that. But in a system sliding towards authoritarianism, opposing the government comes with a price.
What kind of price?
You might face politically motivated investigations, crippling lawsuits, tax audits designed to harass, loss of government contracts or funding, public smearing, threats. The list goes on. Basically, the state makes it risky to be critical.
Okay, that's a very clear indicator to look for. So based on that metric, the cost of opposition, what do these authors conclude about the U.S.?
Their conclusion is, frankly, stark. They argue that the U.S. has crossed the line into competitive authoritarianism.
Already crossed it. Why?
Because, in their view, The documented use of government agencies to target critics and the sheer volume of punitive actions have significantly raised the risk for anyone who dares to oppose the administration.
They provide specific examples to back this up, I assume.
Oh, yes, quite a few. They mention investigations into specific officials who publicly contradicted the president, for instance, on election security, or targeting a state attorney general investigating the administration.
So using the justice system selectively.
That's the allegation, and it extends beyond individuals. They point to law firms perceived as being aligned with the opposition.
The ones we talked about earlier.
Well, similar dynamics. Firms facing being effectively blacklisted from government work, pressure potentially applied to their clients, even employee security clearances threatened.
Which would obviously have a chilling effect on legal representation for opponents.
Absolutely. They also detail scrutiny of online fundraising platforms used by the opposition, leading to fears among donors about being targeted themselves.
Fear of audits, investigations. That would certainly make people think twice about donating.
Then there's the media. Lawsuits against major news outlets using regulatory bodies like the FCC to investigate news organizations critical of the administration, allegations of bias.
Attacks on the press, a classic sign.
And universities, too. Investigations into diversity programs, but also anti-Semitism programs, funding illegally suspended or grants frozen for major universities, threats against tax-exempt status, impacting foreign students.
That's a wide net.
It is. There's a quote included from Jonathan Friedman at PEN America basically saying, universities feel like any one of them could step out of line and face losing critical funding.
A real climate of fear in institutions that should be fostering open debate.
The authors argue this pressure extends even within the ruling party itself, citing threats against Republican politicians who considered opposing the leader, even death threats mentioned in one case. And their point is that this escalation, this authoritarian offensive, as they call it, has happened faster and perhaps more forcefully here than in some other countries that went down this path.
So what's the overall impact they describe?
A tangible chilling effect. People changing their behavior, thinking twice before speaking out or donating or representing certain clients, watchdogs being silenced or intimidated.
They give examples of this chilling effect, too.
Yes. Reduced donations to progressive groups, lawyers becoming hesitant to take on cases against the administration, an instance where a major university reportedly ceded to demands about student expression following a presidential statement.
And the media self-censoring.
That's mentioned too, like a major network allegedly pulling a critical story. And perhaps most worryingly, lawmakers from the ruling party admitting, sometimes privately, that they hold back criticism out of fear of retaliation.
Like the quote from Senator Murkowski they included.
Exactly, all supporting their core argument, that Americans are, in their assessment, living under a new kind of regime where the cost of opposition is dangerously high.
But why hasn't there been, maybe, a bigger outcry from leaders across society?
They suggest it's a collective action problem. Basically, while many leaders might individually prefer democracy, challenging the administration carries personal risks, career risks, financial risks, maybe even safety risks.
So it's safer to stay quiet or appease.
That's the incentive structure they describe. But they warn this is a fatal logic of appeasement. It emboldens the administration, weakens democratic defenses further, and demoralizes society.
Is it presented as irreversible, though?
No, thankfully. They explicitly state the decline is reversible. They point to examples in other countries where authoritarian trends were pushed back. Independent courts could play a role, though they note judges themselves face threats.
So what's needed to reverse it?
Collective action. They stress the need for civil society billionaires, major law firms, universities, media outlets, political parties to coordinate and share the costs of defiance. Make it less risky for any one actor to stand up.
Safety in numbers, essentially.
Pretty much. They actually praise ordinary citizens, saying the most energetic opposition has come from the grassroots, and leaders need to catch up and follow their lead.
Are there any signs of that happening?
They mention a few hopeful signs, an awakening perhaps, specific universities pushing back, a major tech company taking a stand, a new law firm formed specifically to fight back. Small signs, but signs nonetheless.
So the key takeaway is serious situation, potentially reversible, but requires active engagement and shared risk-taking.
That's the core message. And if we circle back quickly to our democracy scale analysis,
how does this cost of opposition idea fit?
It fits perfectly with the transition marker between level 3, a liberal democracy, and level 4, hybrid regime. That transition is marked by a breakdown in accountability, suppression of opponents, muzzling the media.
Which is exactly what raises the cost of opposition.
Precisely. The two concepts align very closely. And that source also points ahead to level 5, authoritarian drift, which features things like militarization of police and even heavier media repression as a potential next stage if these trends aren't countered.
Okay, so pulling it all together, the analysis of these executive orders seems to place the situation, according to these sources, somewhere between illiberal democracy and potentially hybrid regime.
At least level 3, potentially level 4, based on those interpretations.
And this idea of the rising cost of opposition emerges as a really critical, maybe more tangible indicator for everyone to watch. How risky is it to disagree?
It's a key barometer suggested by the experts.
Right. We know you, listening, often want to get a solid grasp on complex issues like this efficiently. We hope this deep dive has offered some clarity, maybe some aha moments on these really vital topics.
And it leaves us with a crucial question, maybe for you to ponder after this. Beyond the big headlines and executive orders, what are the subtle ways democratic norms might erode in everyday life in our communities?
Yeah, and what's our role as individuals in our workplaces, our institutions, in either pushing back against that erosion or maybe unintentionally contributing to it?
It's definitely something worth thinking about.